Some cities are destroyed in war, but Hiroshima was something more difficult to understand, a city the world first had to believe. In the late summer of 1945, Dr. Marcel Junod arrived in Japan carrying the habits of a physician, the discipline of a humanitarian, and the burden of a man who had already seen too much of the Second World War. He was Swiss, trained to look at suffering without turning it into spectacle, and connected to the International Committee of the Red Cross at a moment when the old language of war was beginning to fail. Soldiers had surrendered. Governments were negotiating. Maps were being redrawn. Newspapers in the United States were filling with words like victory, occupation, surrender, and peace. But somewhere beyond those headlines, Hiroshima existed as a wound the world could not yet describe. Reports had reached Tokyo, but they came like broken signals from another age. A city had been struck by a single bomb. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors were running out of supplies. People who had survived the first day were now weakening in ways that ordinary battlefield medicine could not fully explain. The facts were there, but they did not yet feel real to the outside world, because the human mind knows how to understand ruined buildings, but it does not easily understand a new kind of destruction. Dr. Junod did not enter the story as a soldier or a politician. He entered it as a doctor, and that made his mission different. A soldier might ask who had won. A diplomat might ask what would happen next. A doctor asks who is still breathing, who needs medicine, who has been forgotten, and what must be written down before silence covers the evidence. That question pulled him toward Hiroshima before most of the world had any clear picture of what had happened there. In Tokyo, the air after surrender carried an uneasy stillness. The war was over, but peace had not yet become relief. Trains moved through a country exhausted by years of conflict. Offices reopened under new rules. Foreign officials, Japanese authorities, aid workers, and military representatives moved through hallways where every conversation seemed to carry another unanswered question. For Junod, Hiroshima was not simply a place on a map. It was a message arriving too slowly. Each report suggested that the city was facing a medical emergency beyond the reach of normal supplies. Each delay meant more people waiting in crowded rooms, more doctors working with too little, more families looking for help that had not yet arrived. Among them was the atomic bomb survivor, not yet a symbol, not yet a voice in a classroom or museum, but a human being inside a city where survival itself had become uncertain. This survivor represents the people Junod was trying to reach, civilians who did not speak in headlines, who did not belong to strategy meetings, and whose suffering could disappear if no one with a notebook, a medical bag, and a conscience came close enough to listen. The world outside Hiroshima wanted explanations, numbers, and official statements, but the city needed water, medicine, bandages, doctors, records, and witnesses. Junod understood that medicine was only part of the mission. If he could reach Hiroshima, he could help carry supplies into the city, but he could also carry something out: testimony. Not testimony shaped for propaganda, not a dramatic story meant to shock, but a careful medical and humanitarian record of what the atomic bomb had done to living people. That was why this journey mattered. Before he ever stood among the ruins, before he saw the hospitals, before he opened his notebook beside the survivors, Dr. Marcel Junod was already moving toward a truth the world was not ready to face. Hiroshima was calling through fragments, and he was one of the few willing to answer. The first clear message from Hiroshima did not arrive like a dramatic announcement. It came through the kind of desperate report that a doctor understands immediately. Too many patients, not enough medicine, too few supplies, and symptoms that did not fit the familiar patterns of war. For Dr. Marcel Junod, the words carried more weight than any official briefing. A destroyed city could be described by maps and measurements, but a medical crisis had its own language. It spoke through shortages, fever, silence, exhaustion, and the quiet panic of physicians who had done everything they could with almost nothing left in their hands. In Tokyo, Junod listened as the fragments became more urgent. Hiroshima was not asking the world for pity. It was asking for help. Hospitals and temporary treatment spaces were crowded with survivors. Japanese doctors were working under conditions no medical school could have prepared them for. Nurses and volunteers were trying to bring order to a situation that changed from hour to hour. People who had appeared stable could suddenly become weaker. Others needed basic care that might have been simple in an ordinary hospital, but became difficult in a city where medicine, clean supplies, and transportation had all been strained beyond reason. Junid understood that every day mattered. The war had ended on paper, but in Hiroshima, the consequences were still unfolding inside real bodies and real homes. The atomic bomb survivor, like thousands of others, lived inside that delay. To the outside world, survivors could become numbers in a report, but inside the city, each person had a name, a family, a memory of the morning before everything changed, and a future now hanging on whether help could arrive in time. Junid could not allow those people to remain only as rumors. He needed access, supplies, and permission, and none of those things were simple in the first weeks after surrender. Japan was under occupation. Allied authority controlled movement. Humanitarian work required negotiation, patience, and careful language. A truck filled with medicine could not simply appear at the edge of Hiroshima because a doctor believed it was needed. A flight had to be arranged. Supplies had to be gathered. Officials had to be convinced. The need had to be translated into a form that military administrators and relief organizers could approve. This was where Junid's role became larger than ordinary medical work. He was not only preparing to treat patients. He was trying to open a path between a city in distress and a world still trying to decide how much it was willing to see. He argued not with anger, but with the steady urgency of a man trained to count time and lives. Medicine was not symbolic to him. A crate of bandages was not a gesture. A box of plasma, a bottle of antiseptic, a package of surgical supplies, a case of vitamins, or a bundle of clean dressing could become the difference between despair and one more chance. As he worked through the obstacles, the image of Hiroshima became clearer in his mind, even before he arrived. He imagined doctors with sleeves rolled up, nurses moving through rooms without enough rest, patients waiting without complaint because there was no energy left for complaint, and survivors trying to understand why the world beyond their city seemed so distant. In America, newspapers were already explaining the bomb through the language of military success and scientific achievement. In government offices, it was discussed as a weapon that helped end the war. But Junid was being pulled toward another meaning, one written not in strategy, but in hospital corridors. The telegrams and reports from Hiroshima were telling him that this was not only the end of one war. It was the beginning of a question that would outlive every victory speech. What happens when one bomb leaves doctors unable to understand what they are treating? What happens when a city becomes a medical record before it becomes a memory? And what happens if no one reaches the survivors quickly enough to write down the truth? For Junid, those questions could not wait. The city had spoken through fragments, and he began turning those fragments into action. Junid knew that sympathy alone would not reach Hiroshima. A city could not be treated with concern, prayers, or official regret. It needed medicine in boxes, marked, counted, loaded, and carried across the distance between decision and action. That was why the next part of his mission became practical, urgent, and almost painfully specific. He needed supplies, and he needed permission to move them. In the weeks after surrender, Japan was not an open country where aid workers could travel freely. Every route, every aircraft, every truck, and every official contact belonged to a new and uneasy order. The old government was weakened. The occupying authorities were establishing control and relief. Work had to pass through layers of approval. Junid moved through that world not with dramatic speeches, but with the firm persistence of a doctor who understood that paperwork could be as decisive as a scalpel. He had to make officials understand that Hiroshima was not only a place where something had happened. It was a place where something was still happening. Survivors were still waiting. Doctors were still improvising. The atomic bomb survivor and countless others were not living in the past tense. They were living in the long aftermath, where every missing bottle, every delayed shipment, and every unanswered request mattered. The supplies Junid sought became more than medical objects. They became the first pieces of a bridge back to the city. Bandages meant that someone could be cleaned and covered with dignity. Antiseptics meant that doctors could work with more confidence. Vitamins, plasma, surgical instruments, and basic medicines meant that hospitals could stop losing every battle to scarcity. To an outsider, 15 tons of supplies might sound like an impressive number, heavy and substantial, the kind of figure that belongs in a report. But Junid understood that even 15 tons could feel small against the needs of Hiroshima. A city wounded in a new way could swallow crates of medicine faster than the outside world could imagine. Still, it was something real. It was weight. It was effort. It was proof that the cries from Hiroshima had not vanished into the air. As he prepared the shipment, Junid also prepared himself for what could not be packed into any crate. He knew that he was going not only to deliver aid, but to see what others had not yet seen clearly. His notebook would travel with the medicine. His eyes would move from patient to patient, from hospital room to temporary ward, from medical fact to human truth. He would need to listen to Japanese physicians whose exhaustion had become part of their work. He would need to observe symptoms that challenged the ordinary categories of war medicine. He would need to record without exaggeration and without looking away. That balance mattered. If he wrote too little, the world might reduce Hiroshima to a statistic. If he wrote only with emotion, officials might dismiss the record as unbearable testimony rather than evidence. He needed to bring back something careful enough to be believed and human enough to matter. In America, the bomb was still being discussed through victory, science, and the end of a terrible global war. Junid was moving toward another side of the same history, where the question was not whether the war had ended, but what kind of world had begun. The medicine gathered around him was quiet, but it carried a moral force. Each crate said that the people of Hiroshima were not shadows beneath a headline. Each label said that survival deserved attention. Each pound of supplies argued against forgetting. When the arrangements finally took shape, the mission no longer existed only in reports and conversations. It had become cargo waiting to fly, a doctor ready to enter the city, and a fragile hope measured not in promises, but in medicine strong enough to reach those still waiting. The flight to Hiroshima turned the mission from an argument into a reality. Until that morning, the city had existed for Junid through reports, requests, medical lists, and official conversations. Now it was below him, somewhere beyond the windows of an aircraft carrying medicine that had been gathered with urgency and loaded with care. The crates were not dramatic objects. They did not glow with history. They were ordinary things made extraordinary by where they were going. Supplies packed for hospitals, materials meant for doctors who had been asked to keep working after every normal condition of medicine had collapsed around them. Junid understood the weight of that cargo in a way no inventory could fully express. 15 tons was a number that could be written in a report, but in the air above Japan, it became something more personal. It was the distance between a city calling for help and a doctor finally moving toward it. As the plane drew closer, Junid looked down and saw a landscape that did not explain itself easily. From above, Hiroshima did not look like a battlefield in the familiar sense. There were no moving lines, no obvious front, no clear border between military space and civilian life. Instead, the city appeared as a pale, flattened wound in the shape of human habitation, a wide scar where streets, homes, schools, clinics, shops, and memories had once formed a living place. The view was quiet, and that quiet made it harder to absorb. A doctor learns to read signs: temperature, breathing, pulse, color, pressure, the small details that reveal what the body cannot say aloud. But from the sky, Hiroshima seemed to present a sign too large for the eye to measure. It was not simply damage. It was a warning made visible. Junid had seen suffering during the Second World War, but this sight belonged to a different category. The ordinary language of ruins felt too small. He was not looking at one broken building or one damaged district. He was looking at a city where the scale itself had become part of the medical emergency. Somewhere below, the atomic bomb survivor and countless others were waiting in rooms where doctors were short of medicine and long on exhaustion. Somewhere below, families were trying to move through days that no calendar could make ordinary again. Somewhere below, Japanese physicians had been working without the comfort of explanation, treating conditions that seemed to change after the moment of impact had already passed into memory. Junid knew that once the plane landed, he would no longer be able to keep Hiroshima at the distance of reports. He would have to walk through it, smell the dust of it, sit with its doctors, look into the faces of its survivors, and decide how to record what the world had not yet learned how to name. The closer he came, the clearer his responsibility became. He was bringing medicine, but he was also bringing witness. The two could not be separated. Medicine without witness might help the immediate crisis, but leave the larger truth buried. Witness without medicine would be a hollow act. Hiroshima needed both. The practical help that could be placed in a hospital and the careful record that could travel beyond Japan to confront the conscience of the world. When the aircraft descended, the city below no longer felt like an event from weeks earlier. It felt present, immediate, unfinished. The bomb had already fallen. The war had already ended. And yet the story was still unfolding in every survivor who waited for treatment and every doctor who tried to understand what had happened. Junid stepped toward Hiroshima, knowing that the view from above had changed him before he had even touched the ground. He had flown into the evidence of a new age, and now the evidence was waiting to speak. When Junid entered the hospitals, the distance between report and reality disappeared. Until then, he had known Hiroshima through messages, supply lists, aerial impressions, and urgent medical requests. But inside the treatment rooms, the city became human. It was no longer a pale shape seen from above. It was a doctor leaning over a patient with tired hands. It was a nurse moving quietly between beds without enough time to rest. It was a family member sitting nearby, trying to remain calm because panic would not produce medicine. It was the atomic bomb survivor looking back at him with the kind of exhaustion that did not need dramatic words to be understood. Junid had trained himself to observe carefully, because a careless witness can turn suffering into noise. He did not need to exaggerate what he saw. The truth was already heavy enough. The hospitals and temporary care spaces were filled with people who needed help that ordinary wartime medicine had not fully prepared anyone to give. Japanese physicians spoke with him about shortages, strange patterns of illness, and the difficulty of treating patients when every resource had to be stretched. Some supplies were basic, almost painfully ordinary. Clean dressing, medicine, instruments, food, water, places to rest, and hands strong enough to keep working. Yet in Hiroshima, the basic had become precious. A roll of bandage could feel like a promise. A vial of medicine could change the mood in a room. A crate opened at the right moment could give a doctor the strength to continue. Junid listened to the local physicians with respect because he understood that they had been the first line of human response long before he arrived. They had worked without the comfort of full explanation, surrounded by needs that multiplied faster than solutions. He was not there to replace them or to claim their story. He was there to help, to learn, and to carry their testimony beyond the city. The atomic bomb survivor became the moral center of that work. This survivor was not a symbol created for history books, not a photograph in a museum, not a number in a report, but a person whose presence asked a direct question. Would the world see the people of Hiroshima as human beings, or only as evidence of a new weapon? Junid's medical bag could answer part of that question, but his notebook had to answer the rest. He moved through the room slowly, taking in details that would matter later. The silence between patients, the careful discipline of doctors, the shortage of supplies, the unfamiliar symptoms, the way recovery did not follow the expected path, and the way people waited without knowing whether the outside world would ever fully understand. The city had not simply endured a moment of destruction and then begun to heal in a straight line. Its suffering continued in layers. There was the immediate need for care, the uncertainty of symptoms that appeared or deepened over time, the strain on families, and the burden carried by those who survived when so much around them had changed. For an American audience reading headlines about the end of the war, Hiroshima could seem like a completed event. For Junid, standing inside those hospitals, it was unfinished. Every room showed him that history does not end when leaders sign documents or newspapers print final editions. History continues in the breathing of survivors, in the hands of doctors, in the quiet decisions made beside hospital beds, and in the records kept by those who refused to let the truth disappear. As medicine from the shipment began to reach the people who needed it, Junid understood that his mission had entered its most important stage. He had brought supplies into Hiroshima, but now Hiroshima was giving him something in return. The responsibility to remember accurately, to report honestly, and to make sure the world could not look away from the human cost hidden behind the word atomic. The deeper Junid moved into Hiroshima's medical reality, the more clearly he understood that the city had not been wounded in a familiar way. Doctors are trained to notice patterns. They compare one case with another, separate urgent symptoms from ordinary ones, and search for the hidden logic inside suffering. But in Hiroshima, the patterns refused to stay inside the boundaries of known medicine. Some survivors had lived through the first day and seemed, for a moment, to be moving toward recovery, only to grow weaker later in ways that unsettled the physicians caring for them. Others carried signs of illness that did not match the simple idea of a city damaged by blast, heat, or broken infrastructure. The atomic bomb survivor stood inside that mystery, not as an abstract patient in a textbook, but as a living reminder that a new kind of weapon had created a new kind of medical question. Junid listened to Japanese doctors describe what they had seen in the days after the bombing. Their words were careful, because good doctors do not rush toward conclusions when lives are involved. Yet their concern was unmistakable. Patients were not always following expected paths. Recovery could appear, then fade. Strength could return, then disappear. Ordinary supplies helped, but they did not answer everything. Bandages could cover what was visible. Medicine could support the body. Clean water, rest, and food could give survivors a chance. But beneath the visible crisis was something less understood, something that moved through time and made the aftermath feel unfinished. Junid recognized that this was why the record mattered. If Hiroshima were described only as a ruined city, the world might miss the deeper meaning. If it were described only as a military event, the human truth would vanish beneath strategy. The doctors of Hiroshima were dealing with evidence that the age of atomic warfare had entered the human body in ways that could not be measured by broken streets alone. Junid did not need to use dramatic language. His task was more difficult than that. He had to observe with restraint, write with precision, and protect the dignity of the people whose suffering had become part of history before they had any choice in the matter. He noted shortages, symptoms, hospital conditions, medical uncertainty, and the urgent need for continued assistance. He paid attention to the atmosphere of the wards, where exhaustion sat beside discipline and silence often carried more meaning than speech. The atomic bomb survivor, like many others, did not need to explain the entire event for the doctor to understand its weight. A glance, a pause, a careful movement, a quiet attempt to sit upright, a family member waiting nearby. All of it became part of the record Junid knew the world needed. In the United States, many people were still reading about the atomic bomb as an ending. The weapon that helped close the war, the achievement of science, the final pressure that forced surrender. But inside Hiroshima's hospitals, Junid saw that the bomb was also a beginning. It opened a question that medicine, politics, and morality would have to carry for generations. What did it mean when one weapon could leave behind effects that doctors were still struggling to understand weeks later? What did it mean when survival itself became uncertain after the moment of danger had passed? What did it mean when the true measure of a bomb could not be found only in buildings, maps, or official statements, but in the slow and fragile condition of human beings trying to live? Junid's notebook became more than a medical record. It became a defense against forgetting. Every careful observation pushed back against the idea that Hiroshima could be reduced to a military success or a scientific milestone. Every detail insisted that the world look at the survivor, the doctor, the hospital, the shortage, the uncertainty, and the long human shadow cast by a single flash of history. He had come with medicine, but now he was gathering something just as necessary, the evidence of a new kind of wound that no responsible world could ignore. By the time Junid had listened to the doctors, walked through the treatment rooms, and studied the patterns that ordinary medicine could not easily explain, his role had changed. He had entered Hiroshima as a physician carrying supplies, but the city had made him into something else as well, a witness. This did not mean standing at a distance and describing suffering as if it belonged to someone else. It meant accepting responsibility for what he had seen, for what he could verify, and for what the world might prefer not to hear. A doctor's first duty is to the person in front of him, but in Hiroshima, the person in front of him also carried a message for humanity. The atomic bomb survivor was not asking to become part of history. The survivor was simply trying to live, to breathe through another hour, to rest in a room where medicine had arrived too late for some, but not too late for all, to trust that the people taking notes were not turning pain into spectacle. Junid understood that difference. To write about Hiroshima carelessly would be another form of harm. To write nothing would be a betrayal. So he watched with discipline. He recorded shortages, symptoms, hospital conditions, the need for continued aid, and the quiet courage of Japanese medical workers who had kept treating others while carrying the weight of their own exhaustion. He saw that the city's story could not be contained in the language of military victory or defeat. Hiroshima was not only a target that appeared on a wartime map. It was a place where families had lived, where children had walked to school, where doctors had made rounds, where shopkeepers had opened doors, where ordinary people had expected the future to arrive in ordinary ways. Now that future had been interrupted by a force so new that even the words used to explain it seemed inadequate. Junid's notebook became a place where the old language met the new reality. He could write about hospitals, but the hospitals were not normal hospitals. He could write about patients, but the patients were living through an aftermath that did not behave like familiar wounds of war. He could write about aid, but aid itself was part of a larger question. Could medicine keep up with weapons that changed the meaning of human vulnerability? In the rooms he visited, the survivor's presence gave that question a face without needing to turn it into a symbol. The dignity of the survivor mattered as much as the facts. The care given by Japanese doctors mattered as much as the supplies brought from outside. The quiet exchange between those who suffered and those who tried to help became the moral center of the record. Junid knew that people far away, especially in the United States, might want a simpler story. They might want the bomb to remain an ending, a final sentence at the close of a long and devastating war. They might want to believe that once surrender came, the moral questions could be folded away with the newspapers. But Hiroshima did not allow that. Inside the city, the ending had opened into a long medical and human reckoning. People were still waiting for care. Doctors were still trying to understand what they were seeing. Survivors were still proving, simply by living, that history was not finished with them. Junid's responsibility was to carry that truth beyond the wards and streets of Hiroshima without weakening it, exaggerating it, or hiding from it. He had to make the world understand that the atomic bomb was not only a weapon of conclusion. It was a question placed before every hospital, every government, every scientist, every soldier, and every ordinary citizen who believed that victory could be separated from consequence. In Hiroshima, Junid became the kind of witness history rarely expects but desperately needs. Not the loudest voice, not the most powerful official, but a doctor with medicine in one hand, records in the other, and the conscience to understand that what he had seen belonged not only to Japan, but to the world. When Junid prepared to carry the truth beyond Hiroshima, he faced a different kind of obstacle. The city had already shown him what a weapon could do to hospitals, families, doctors, and survivors, but now he had to confront what silence could do to memory. The world after the war was crowded with official statements, military reports, diplomatic language, and the exhaustion of nations that wanted to move forward. People wanted endings. Governments wanted order. Newspapers wanted clear explanations that could fit beneath a headline. Hiroshima did not fit easily into any of those needs. It was too new, too unsettling, and too full of questions that reached beyond one city and one moment in history. Junid understood that if the record was weak, incomplete, or delayed too long, the human meaning of Hiroshima could be buried beneath the language of strategy. He had seen the hospitals, spoken with physicians, followed the movement of medicine, and looked into the faces of survivors whose experiences could not be reduced to a number. Now he needed to turn that witness into a report strong enough to resist forgetting. The atomic bomb survivor remained at the center of that responsibility. In the quiet presence of the survivor, Junid saw why language mattered. A survivor could not be treated as proof in an argument or as an image for public shock. A survivor was a person with a past, a family, a body still trying to heal, and a future that deserved more than pity. That was why Junid's record had to be careful. It had to protect dignity while still telling the truth. It had to describe medical uncertainty without turning mystery into drama. It had to show the need for aid without using suffering as spectacle. This balance was difficult, but it was the only honest way forward. Outside Hiroshima, the world was already forming its own version of events. In the United States, many people understood the atomic bomb through the relief of war ending. After years of loss, fear, and sacrifice, the idea of a weapon that helped bring surrender carried a powerful emotional force. For many families, the end of the war meant sons coming home, ships returning, ration books fading from daily life, and the possibility of peace after years of anxiety. Junid did not ignore that reality. He knew the war had been immense and terrible across continents. But Hiroshima forced another reality into view. The end of a war did not erase the responsibility to understand what had been done in order to end it. The city asked whether victory could be remembered honestly if consequence was left outside the frame. As Junid's notes, reports, and testimony moved outward, they entered a world not fully prepared to receive them. Some people would read them as humanitarian evidence. Some would see them as uncomfortable questions. Some would prefer the clean lines of official history to the difficult details of hospital rooms. But Junid's duty was not to make the truth easier. His duty was to keep it accurate. He had brought medicine into Hiroshima, and now he was carrying memory out of it. The records he shaped were not only about one emergency shipment or one visit to a devastated city. They were part of a larger warning about what modern war could become when science, military power, and distance separated decision-makers from human bodies. The survivor in Hiroshima, the doctor at the bedside, the nurse without enough supplies, and the patient waiting in silence all belonged inside the world's understanding of the atomic age. Junid knew that history often becomes quieter as it moves away from the people who lived it. Details fade. Pain becomes abstract. Reports become archives. But if the record was strong enough, if it remained tied to real people and real medical truth, then Hiroshima could not be dismissed as a single wartime event already finished by surrender. It would remain what he had seen it to be, a human warning, written in hospitals, carried by survivors, and preserved by those who understood that silence can be as dangerous to memory as destruction is to a city. Years later, what Junid carried out of Hiroshima did not remain only in a medical file. It became part of the moral record of the 20th century, a record that asked the world to remember that the atomic age did not begin in laboratories, military briefings, or newspaper headlines alone. It began also in hospital rooms, in the quiet work of exhausted doctors, in the eyes of survivors, and in the difficult effort to describe what ordinary language could not contain. Junid had entered Hiroshima with medicine because the city needed immediate help, but he left with something that would last longer than any shipment of supplies. He left with witness. He had seen that the meaning of the bomb could not be measured only by the speed with which the war ended or the power of the weapon that had been used. It had to be measured by the human beings who lived after it, by the physicians who tried to understand what they were treating, and by the survivors whose lives continued beyond the moment the world first learned their city's name. The atomic bomb survivor remained at the center of that meaning, not as an image designed to shock, not as a number placed into a report, but as a person whose survival carried memory forward. In the survivor's continued life was a truth that no government statement could erase. The consequences of war do not stop when the fighting stops. They move through bodies, families, cities, and generations. They enter classrooms, museums, medical journals, humanitarian law, and the conscience of people who were not there but must still decide what kind of world they are willing to accept. Junid's records helped make that decision harder to avoid. They did not solve the atomic age. They did not bring back what Hiroshima had lost. They did not turn history into something simple. But they forced a necessary question into the open. If one weapon could create suffering that doctors were still trying to understand weeks later, then could the world ever again speak about war as if distance protected the innocent from consequence? For many Americans, Hiroshima had first appeared as part of the final chapter of the Second World War, tied to relief, victory, and the hope that no more families would have to send sons across the ocean. That feeling was real, and history cannot be honest if it ignores it. But Junid's witness added the other side of the ledger. It reminded the world that the end of one fear could become the beginning of another. It showed that a weapon celebrated for ending a war also opened a permanent debate about human limits, medical responsibility, and the moral cost of power. In that debate, the doctor's role was not to shout above the politicians or rewrite the military history of the war. His role was quieter and, in some ways, more difficult. He had to preserve what he saw with enough precision that it could not be dismissed, and enough humanity that it could not become abstract. That is why the story still matters. A doctor entered Hiroshima when the world knew too little, when the survivors needed more than sympathy, and when the truth could still have been softened by distance. He brought medicine into the city, listened to those who had lived through the impossible, recorded conditions that demanded attention, and carried a humanitarian warning beyond Japan. What he documented was not only the suffering of one city, but the arrival of a new responsibility for all cities. Hiroshima became a place the world could not ignore because witnesses like Junid refused to let it become only a military fact. They made it a human truth. And in the end, that was the record that survived. A doctor with a notebook, a survivor with a life beyond the ruins, and a city that taught the world that some evidence is not written to accuse the past, but to protect the future.